Okay, welcome back. Let's talk about the influence of the media on voting behaviour in the UK. So how the leader is viewed by the electorate is arguably determined not so much by their own qualities as by the way in which they are depicted in the media. In 1983, for example, one incident of Michael Foot tripping over whilst making a speech was repeatedly aired throughout the election campaign, contributing to his image as a bumbling oaf, contrasting with more flattering images of Margaret Thatcher. This power to choose which images to endlessly repeat and which to suppress, which qualities to highlight and which to ignore, which quotes to repeat and which to bury, give the media tremendous power over how the public perceives each political party and its leadership. And whilst the broadcast media is expected to maintain certain standards of balance and impartiality, the print media has no such legal obligations. Newspapers can be openly partisan in their support or opposition for a particular party right up until election day. And with over 7 million copies distributed in the UK each day, this puts them in an incredibly powerful position. The more so since people are increasingly less likely to get their political education from face-to-face settings such as trade union meetings or local associations, and correspondingly more likely to be reliant on the media for political information. The support of the media, therefore, is often seen as a crucial factor behind electoral success. Most famously, The Sun proclaimed in 1992 that it was the Sun what won it. That was their headline quote the day after the election. The Sun what won it for the Conservatives, following their vicious and frankly racist campaign against Labour leader Neil Kinnock, who they referred to as the Welsh windbag. Kinnock's successor Tony Blair was determined to get the media on his side, and after a series of meetings with the Sun's owner Rupert Murdoch, Murdoch threw his support behind Labour. This meant that Blair's Labour Party had the support of not only the Daily Mirror, the Independent and the Guardian, the traditionally left-leaning but lower circulation papers, but also now the Sun and the Times, which have a combined circulation of around 2 million, more than a quarter of the daily readership in the UK. Blair's Labour Party went on to win a landslide victory in the 1997 general election, winning almost 2/3 of the common seats, and this may well have been helped by the media's overwhelmingly positive coverage of Blair and the Labour Party. In contrast, in the 2019 campaign, the media campaign against Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party was unremittingly hostile. Of the 10 newspapers with the biggest circulation, all of them except The Guardian and The Mirror opposed Corbyn's Labour Party. And even The Guardian, whilst it did call for a Labour vote in 2019, had for the previous 2 years been leading the media campaign against Corbyn's alleged anti-Semitism. Deborah Mattinson argued that the media depiction of Corbyn in 2017 had been largely as someone a bit daft and harmless, but Labour's successes in that election frightened them, and that's when they began to depict him as a dangerous and anti-Semitic terrorist sympathiser. But how much influence do the media have really? The role of the media in shaping public opinion has been particularly emphasised by the dominant ideology model. This suggests that voting behaviour is primarily influenced by the ideology of powerful elites who project ideas that suit their interests, and that they do this particularly through their ownership of the media. With the exception of the BBC, the vast majority of both print and broadcast media is privately owned by a handful of billionaires. For example, just 5 billionaires control the media outlets consumed by more than 75% of the news readership in the UK. All of them supported the Conservatives in 2015, with the sole exception of the pornographer Richard Desmond, whose Express and Star newspapers supported UKIP. Indeed, the newspapers and websites consumed by more than half the news readership in the UK are controlled by just 2 men, Rupert Murdoch and Lord Rothermere, who between them own 8 of the most widely read newspapers in the country, including The Sun, The Times, The Daily Mail, The Metro and The Eye. Given the 2019 Labour manifesto commitment to raise taxes on the rich, to crack down on tax avoidance by billionaires, and to nationalise key industries, which would prevent their use as a source of profit for wealthy investors, it's no surprise that billionaires such as Rothermere and Murdoch felt that a Labour government would be an unacceptable threat to their class interests, and sought to demonise the party and its leadership in order to prevent them ever coming to power. Research by Loughborough University found that newspaper coverage of Labour was overall 70% more negative than positive during the 2019 election campaign, whilst coverage of the Conservatives was 30% more positive than negative. However, this still doesn't prove that the media is influencing voters. It could be, of course, that newspapers are simply following public opinion in the hope of selling more papers, following the public turn against Corbyn rather than leading it, for example. So, for example, it was only once there had already been a swing of 12.5% from Labour to the Conservatives during Blair's third term that the Sun then switched its support to the Conservatives ahead of the 2010 election. Thus, opponents of the dominant ideology model argue that the media mirrors public opinion more than it shapes it. is known as the reinforcement model, we'll come to later. Nevertheless, parties often go to great lengths to win newspaper support, which suggests that they at least believe it to be highly influential. In an age where people's perceptions of party leaders are overwhelmingly shaped by media coverage, it seems that media is very likely to be a major influence on voting behaviour. But exactly how does this influence work? There are four main models of media influence on elections, ranging from the direct to the more subtle. At the most extreme end of the spectrum is what's called the direct effect theory, formulated in the 1930s, which claims that the media directly affects how we think and vote. This will be very much in line with the dominant ideology model and will consider people like Rupert Murdoch to be very powerful, with their ideas transmitted through the newspapers they control to millions of people, directly affecting their own opinions, including, of course, who to vote for. A second way of viewing media influence on voting behaviour is through agenda-setting theory. This theory suggests that the media does not so much influence how we think about certain issues, as much as what issues we think about. That is, what issues become more, the word is salient, means kind of really relevant, prioritised. So, for example, a voter may support both higher spending on the NHS, a traditional Labour policy, and more restrictions on immigration, a traditional Conservative policy. Such voters are known as cross-pressured, their preferences on different issues pointing them in two different directions electorally. Now, according to agenda-setting theory, the media is unlikely to be able to change voters' opinions about any of these issues, but it is able to help to determine which issue that they're thinking about, which are the issue they therefore consider to be the most important, and therefore which party they're likely to vote for. Let's take our imaginary cross-pressured voter who supports the NHS but opposes immigration as an example. If the media concentrates its attention on illegal immigration, crimes committed by immigrants, or people arriving by boat, etc., then a voter who already supports restrictions on immigration is more likely to have the immigration issue in the top of his mind when he's deciding who to vote for, and therefore most likely to vote for the party whose policies match this view, in this case Conservative, because this voter's attention has been focused on this issue. If, however, the media focuses on stories around NHS underfunding and waiting lists and problems with NHS privatisation, etc., that same voter, who already believes in better funding for the NHS, may consider this to be the most important issue, because this is the focus now of their attention, and thus vote for the party whose policies reflect this belief, in this case Labour. Now, the voters' views have been not affected by the media in either of these cases. They already wanted more NHS funding, and they already wanted greater restriction on immigration, but the priority, the attention given to these issues by the media has affected their voting behaviour by giving certain issues more what's called salience. A good example of that was that in 1997 most voters held views on the EU that were much closer to the Conservative Party than to Labour. But the issue of the EU was not then a salient issue, was barely covered in the media, and thus it did not have much effect on voting behaviour. In 2019, however, the focus on Brexit meant that the EU had now become a much more salient issue to the benefit of the Conservatives. In other words, according to the agenda-setting theory, the media rarely changes people's opinions on issues, but it can and does affect how much importance and priority they give to different issues. It can influence which issues are seen as more important. And in the case of cross-pressured voters, this can then influence how they vote. I would just add here that our imaginary pro-NHS anti-immigration voter is in fact not so imaginary, and in fact reflects the basic position of many of the crucial Red Wall voters who helped deliver the Conservatives' historic victory in 2019. These voters are typically left of average on economic issues, supporting greater spending on frontline public services, but more right-wing than average on social issues such as crime and immigration. Thus, the media's often obsessive focus on immigration and crime has been hugely beneficial to the Conservatives, according to this agenda-setting theory. A third model of how the media affects voting behaviour is what is known as framing theory. This suggests that the media can subtly influence how we think about particular issues through how it presents certain stories. The same story can produce different effects according to things like whose perspective is the story told from, how is language such as metaphor used to give a positive or negative spin, who is presented as the hero or the villain of the piece, and which facts are emphasised and which downplayed. Ed Miliband, for example, who was essentially a centrist politician, was portrayed by the right-wing press as a socialist, nicknaming him Red Ed, while the Daily Mail ran a front-page headline characterising his father, Ralph Miliband, as the man who hated Britain. One example of a consistent bias in framing is in media coverage of the issue of Palestine. Studies by Glasgow Media Group have shown that media coverage rarely frames the issue in terms of ongoing land theft, military occupation and apartheid being imposed on Palestinians by Israel, provoking sporadic resistance once things reach breaking point, but rather frames it as an issue of Palestinian religious terrorism. This framing led neatly to the framing of Corbyn as a terrorist sympathiser rather than as an opponent of military occupation and apartheid, which clearly influenced voter perceptions of him. A final theory of media influence on voting behaviour is known as reinforcement theory. This theory suggests that media does not influence public opinion so much as it reflects it. Any correlation that might exist between media consumption and voting patterns, therefore, comes about simply because we tend to choose media that supports our existing views. Evidence of the limited influence of media on voting behaviour comes from the fact that in 2015, for example, readers of The Independent tended to vote Labour even though the paper called for support for the Conservative Lib Dem coalition, and Express readers tended to vote Conservative even though the paper was calling for a UKIP vote. Now, this theory is correct to point out that the simple act of calling for voters to vote a certain way does not automatically guarantee that its readers will do so. Yet it is a weak argument against the more sophisticated agenda setting and framing theories of media influence, which show how media shapes voter preferences in a much more subtle and ongoing way, which nevertheless can and does influence voting patterns. Ultimately, although it's impossible to prove the extent of media influence on voting behaviour one way or the other, given that people's political information comes so overwhelmingly from the media, it's hard to avoid the conclusion that the way such information is selected and presented is very likely to have a major influence on people's political perceptions and therefore their voting behaviour. But parties themselves do, of course, have some control over how they and their policies are viewed, as they are also engaged in direct communication with the public through their election campaign. And so the campaign is the final recency factor to which we will now turn. And I should just say in this next final video, there's also going to be a little focus on social media as well. So we'll return to the issue of media in the final video. Thanks for watching.